A lot of people say that newer is better. Sure, a good chunk of the time, newer is better. But people never seem to ask is how is it better? And what was changed to make that element better? And of course, there's the most important question of what was sacrificed to improve this. A few days ago, I made a video on the old D&D alignment definitions. It was well received for my channel's videos, and there's more about the old system that I didn't mention in that video. While I don't make money from YouTube, nor do I ever intend to, I do like to help people. So without further ado, here's how alignment used to work in D&D. Currently in 5e, it's back to being a selection of static choices, which, yes, that's how Gary Gygax designed alignment for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but it's not how it's always been. So back in the day, Gygax couldn't find a publisher for D&D, so he and a friend founded this company called TSR, which stands for Tactical Studies Rules. Everyone knows it way better as TSR because Tactical Studies Rules is kind of a silly name. So eventually, Gygax felt he was the odd man out at TSR, and he left it in 1986, and in doing so, gave up all control over D&D. Now, I'm not going to go over the history of D&D in the 80s. All you need to know is that by 1996, TSR was in financial doo-doo, mostly because they'd written way too many supplements for AD&D and created so many settings that they were, quote, cannibalizing our own sales, end quote. So, yeah, the same problems that led them to make 4th edition and 5th edition and the eventual 6th edition happened with AD&D too. It's always been a problem. Anyways, back in the late 90s, it was time to take away the game some people loved and replace this thing that everyone plays with a shiny new toy that everyone will play, thus making it basically impossible to play the older versions. Anyways, that shiny new toy was 3.0, which TSR did not create. They actually folded over how many supplements and bad financing that they did because of this whole problem of way too much crap for AD&D. So they folded and they sold everything to Wizards of the Coast, who revamped the game, creating 3.0, which they released in the year 2000. Now this is important because the more popular and well-known 3.5 didn't come out till 2003, and the video game Neverwinter Nights came out in 2002. Why am I talking about a computer game when I said I was going to be talking about D&D's alignment system? Well, that's because Neverwinter Nights is an almost perfect digitization of the 3.0 rule set, and due to the rarity of the 3.0 books in the current year, the best way to play with 3.0 yourself is to grab a copy of Neverwinter Nights 1, because you can get it through Steam. So if you want to play with the system I'm about to describe and see it in action, but you don't have a gaming group and you don't want to house rule your 5th edition in order to try this out, that's how you can do it. Anyways, the people tasked with creating the next edition of D&D back in 97 were Jonathan Tweet, Monty Cook, and Skip Williams. According to an outspoken critic of AD&D, they stayed true to the roots of the game and captured the best parts of it while shedding decades of detritus and poor design. Now, one of the elements they and many critics of D&D saw as poor design was the alignment system, as it was a series of little blocks that one would select just one of in order to represent their character, NPC, or the monster, or an entire culture or group of people. So alignment is how we first understand people and creatures in this fictional world. Sure, it's not the best way we could do that, but it's how we do that. This is why having a limited set of choice and a few static tags and labels is not necessarily a good thing. It implies people suddenly become good or even poorly or chaotic, or that they're just that way, period, no matter what. Or the worst part of that is the idea that some threshold is reached and then suddenly people start acting differently. That's not true to life at all, and it's even worse if you write a story that way and the story is meant to be about someone's descent into malicious evil or redemption into being a good person. If you write a story like that, it's gonna be crappy. After all, that's how Anakin Skywalker changes in the Star Wars prequels. Yeah, I know, they give him a gradual transition in the Clone Wars cartoon. It's way more believable. But that's not what we got at first. That's the fix for the sudden alignment change pop we got in the movie. That pop was so terrible and bad that we did that alignment fix, guys. Come on. So, John, Mont, and Skip decided 3.0 would have this gradient system for alignment, something that you could use as a measuring stick to see roughly where someone was ethically and morally, and also track their changes in general behavior over time. They took that system of 9 blocks and turned it into a pair of stats with gamified rules. It worked like this. You have the moral dimension, which reflects good and evil, and the ethical dimension, which reflects law and chaos. Both dimensions are plotted from 0 to 100. On the moral dimension, 0 is as evil as can be, while 100 is as good as can be. On the ethical dimension, 0 is as chaotic as can be, and 100 is as lawful as can be. The neutral categories occupy the range of 31 to 69 on both axes. Now, a brief recap from my last video. In D&D, good means you're motivated by altruism, i.e. selflessness, while evil means you're motivated by personal gain, i.e. selfishness. Meanwhile, law means you live by some code or another you stick to very strictly, while chaos means you take things as they come and treat everything in a way that feels right at the time. Back to our task at hand, we have our 2 number lines and our ranges for each category. This creates the grid everyone is familiar with for the alignments, but also shows you the part that's been left out by modern additions. There's numbers and units here. You can plot a point on the grid because the grid is supposed to be a graph which changes over time because of how people change based on what happens to them and what they do in life. Now, there's no real official way of doing this exactly. It was kind of an optional rule set to do one or the other. So there were recommendations for using a D3 for minor acts of morality and ethics, or a D6 for more major ones, and they also had some static number recommendations you could use instead, but I prefer the dice version of this. After all, while you might be moved in the moments to give a needy child a stack of coins, it's not guaranteed to change your behavior in the long term all that much, or maybe it could, who knows. So I'll explain how this worked using the dice method instead of the static number method. So imagine there's a human fighter named Bob. Bob's kind of a good guy. He's in the lower range of good with a moral score of 72, and he's pretty chaotic with an ethics score of 28. This makes him have an alignment of 2872, or in words, he's chaotic good. Bob is exploring some caves one day and comes across a wounded knight. The knight pleads for help, but Bob is conflicted. The knight's wounds are pretty bad and he'll die without help, but if he died, Bob could take his sword and shield, which Bob could very much use because his sword and shield are pretty worn out by the adventure. His shield's all hacked to bits from blocking orcs' axes, and his sword's got kind of rusty and dull, and he could either use replacer or some serious maintenance, and well, he doesn't have the tools to maintain it right now. So in the end, Bob chooses to let the knight die of his wounds and take the knight's stuff. This is an evil act since Bob is being motivated by selfishness, but it's not the worst thing Bob could do. He's not slitting the knight's throat, he's just letting him die of existing wounds. And even further compounding this, the act is not against Bob's culture's ethics either, because his culture has no expectations of giving aid to the wounded, i.e. he's not violating a code in any way or even bending a code by choosing not to help the knight, which makes this a purely moral decision. A moral decision that the DM decides is a minor act of evil, and so the DM rolls a d3 for this minor moral act and gets a 3. Since this is an evil act, we subtract that 3 from Bob's 72 to get 69. Since Bob's moral score has dropped below 70, he is no longer classified as good, but neutral. His ethics score is unchanged by the act, so that makes his score a 2869, or chaotic neutral. Bob's alignment has officially changed, and anything which he had that depended on his alignment being good to function either stops working or applies whatever penalty or effect it has. Yeah, brief aside, that's why so many items in older editions of D&D had alignment-based effects. It's because alignment was a game mechanic that changed over time based on your actions. But why? Simply for fun? No. Certainly fun's a part of it. There's a bigger issue at play with the system. One of the hardest things for a DM to do is to handle a group of murder hobos. There's nothing wrong with playing D&D like it's Diablo or being equal characters, but if the DM wants to tell a story and half the players want to experience that story, while the other half want to kill, burn, and be evil, or even worse, just ruin the DM and the other player's good time, these players, sadly, in these situations, what's the DM to do? Well, in 3.0, the DM was able to make use of this alignment system as a tool to rein in the people who are motivated more by numbers than by story. To many people, if some NPC gets upset with them because their character did a thing, it means nothing at all. Personally, I think those people should stop playing tabletop games and go pick up World of Warcraft, because the thing tabletop RPGs do that nothing else can is allow you to be a part of a story that you tell with your friends. But regardless, imagine if those players suddenly had a numerical reward or penalty for their in-game actions, one which affected their precious DPS, because suddenly the Holy Sword of Fire can be all, "I'm sorry, Bob, but you are too selfish to use me anymore," And instead of that merely being a social conflict because the DM is just saying the sword thinks that now, there's a clear history established by the change of a numerical stat to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that no, Bob really is too much of an asshole to use that weapon's special flaming hand of fiery doom ability anymore. Instead of just being a punishment, it's also a way to resolve problems. Bob's player can find some positive in-game action to gain points back towards being good to get that power back. It empowers the DM by taking the vitriol away from them, but also empowers the player, giving the player more control and influence over their character. It's an equalizer, and it's not oriented towards forcing them to be good either. If you wanted to play Bob as a person falling to villainy, it would let you track his progress towards this goal. It would give you a means of working towards things where no single act can be responsible for the transformation. That good alignment weapon could be abandoned for one which promises power to those evil at heart instead, because alignment is a nuanced system composed of 2 stats intended to help the entire table roleplay their characters. Or rather, it was. Then 2003 rolled around, and Wizards of the Coast decided to further simplify D&D with 3.5, and this version of the alignment system was mangled to save space in the book, thus making the game seem simpler so more people would pick it up as new players. They saved on production and shipping costs while also gaining some more mass appeal. But what did they lose? They lost depth, nuance, and a valuable tool for players and DMs alike, replacing it with the same nonsensical label system that had been causing problems for years, while making it still look shiny and new by retaining the grid pattern. In other words, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. If you're a DM, next time you run, try implementing the old alignment system in your game as a house rule. I don't use it all the time, mostly because currently I have the pleasure of running for a table who cares far more for telling a story than playing a board game. But back when I ran for several groups at once, and even just when I ran for singular groups that preferred a more balanced arrangement of combat and story, the old alignment system proved to be an invaluable tool for keeping the game interesting, dynamic, and letting characters grow, as those 2 numbers make players stop and think for a moment before choosing their actions. And if you don't have a group to play with, that's fine. Pick up Neverwinter Nights and give the game a go. You'll find this system has been implemented in full within the game, such that many actions you take will change your alignment incrementally. The game even awards titles like the Honorable or the Malicious based on your alignment scores. So a neat little cherry on top that the game designers of Neverwinter Nights added on top of the 3.0 rules. Hopefully, if enough of you guys like the old alignment system and talk about it on public spaces, Wizards will take notice and bring it back.